So today's program is titled Gardening Questions Answered, Tree Care. My name is Susan Njai, and I'm the community horticulture educator, and I run the Master Gardener Volunteer Program. And today with us, we have Cecile Jones, who is a Master Gardener Volunteer, and then also Cecilia Lillard, another Master Gardener Volunteer. Let's dive right in. Cecile, take it away.
So one of the most frequently asked questions is, what's the best tree to plant in my yard? And without being smart alecky or anything, the answer is, well, the best tree for your yard is the one that you deliberately and carefully select to suit your particular landscape. And that's just a roundabout way of saying you got to find the right tree for the right place. Okay, so how do you go about doing that? You have certain factors that you need to consider. The first one is the height. You just have to decide, do you want a very tall tree, less than 30 feet? Do you want a shrub? So think that through before, and then you have to consider the canopy of the tree. If the canopy is going to be 20 feet wide, you don't want to plant the tree 10 feet away from your home because, you know, the trunks are going to butt into your roof and create havoc. And the third factor would be you have to decide what type of tree you want. Do you want a deciduous tree? Do you want an evergreen? And then you have to decide on the form or the shape of the tree. You know, if you decide on a column-shaped tree, that's going to take up a lot of space. If you're planting a tree for energy efficiency, you want a V-shaped tree or a round tree because that'll give you a better spread and shade so that it'll help you in your cooling costs in the summer. You also want to think about the growth rate. A fast-growing tree usually is not going to live as long as a slow-growing tree. And you want to think about how many years you want to wait until the tree reaches full maturity. The sixth one is considering the sun, soil, and moisture requirements of the tree. We have a nice video on soil testing, which you're going to need to do, and you need to watch out for how much sun exposure and moisture requirements are going to be in that plot of land that you're thinking of planting a tree. You also want to think about, do you want a tree that bears fruit so that you can feed the birds, let's say in the winter? Or maybe you don't want that. Maybe you don't want fruit droppings, or maybe you don't want to harvest fruit. And of course, don't forget about the hardness zone, which indicates the temperature extremes in which that tree can be expected to grow. We're in hardness zone 6A and B, but it's really because the climate, as we know, is changing. You need to consider maybe zone 7. So there it is, the 8 factors to consider when you're planting a tree. So how do you find a tree now if you've considered this? There's a woody plant database that's hosted by Cornell University. And let's give you a demo of how you can use this database to select a tree for your needs, for your particular landscape. So you click on the search the database, and then you enter the size of the tree you want. Let's say you want a tree that's less than 30 feet. Let's say you get full sun, so you would click on that. Your hardiness zones would be, let's say 7. You want a deciduous tree because you want the fall colors and you don't want the leaves in the winter. Let's say your soil can tolerate natural soil and your pH is between 5 to 7.4. You don't need to worry about the salt tolerance because it's not near the roads. And maybe you have consistently moist, well-drained soil. So after picking all that, you do the search and you get a list of trees that would be suitable for your space. There's another database that's hosted by the University of Connecticut, which is this woody plant database. It's pretty much the same as the one that Cornell hosts. So when you plant a tree, what's the best time to plant a tree and how do I take care of it? So here we go. The first thing is the best practices for tree planting is do a soil test. We can't emphasize enough the importance of that. And again, there's a video on how to do a soil test, which Susan will put in the chat. The second was you need to pick a smaller plant. Now, it's really tempting to pick a large plant because you're probably anxious, you want the tree to grow. But really, if it's less expensive to pick a smaller plant, it will adjust better, than the larger plants when you plant it in your yard. It will require a smaller hole for you to dig. And it's kind of fun to watch the smaller plant grow. The third one would be to dig a very wide hole. So if the root ball, you can see there, the root ball is, let's say 9 inches, you want the hole to be 3 times as wide as the depth of the root ball. So you want that hole to be at least 27 inches, and you want it to be shaped like that, sort of going out in a shallow space, because the roots tend to spread out or splay out horizontally. So you want the roots to spread out. And you want to make sure that if you have very compact soil, you want to give it at least 20% compost to amend the soil a little bit. You don't want to give 50% compost because you're not replacing the soil. The tree has to reside in that soil. You just want to help the soil and improve it a little bit. Number 4 is you want to loosen the roots. The roots will grow in a circular manner if they can't splay out. So you have to find a way for them to splay out by cutting lines vertically with a knife and then loosening the roots so that they can splay out. 5th one is watering consistently, because after you plant the tree, your job is not over. For the first 2 weeks, you probably need to water daily. And then for weeks 3 and 12, you probably need to water every 2 or 3 days. And then after that, weekly. When is the best time to plant a tree? Early spring and early fall. You want the tree to adjust and have time to grow before the seasonal extremes.
All right, thank you so much, Cecile. So
Okay.
now I'm going to answer a few questions. So one common question we get is, how often do I fertilize my tree? Everyone's ready to throw down some NPK. And the answer to that is most trees don't need to be fertilized. They really don't. You should never add fertilizer at planting. Cecile was saying if you're going to amend your soil, 20% compost is the max that you want to add. If you add any more than that, what's going to happen is the tree is going to adjust to the soil within the hole you've dug, and it's not going to want to leave. And so the roots will start circling that hole like it's in a container. If you get your soil test and you see that you really need to add some stuff, you want to get that soil how it's going to be in that area before you even plant your tree, especially if you need to change the pH for the plant that you're planting. And then if you fertilize your lawn around your tree, which most people fertilize their lawn, you're already fertilizing the tree. So your tree's not going to need any additional fertilizer on top of that. So here's a guy, he's putting down fertilizer on his lawn and his tree is soaking up that fertilizer. You know, the roots are intertwined. And so if you fertilize your lawn, you're probably already fertilizing your trees. So there's no need to add any additional fertilizer. So another big thing when it comes to trees is mulch. So how much mulch should you put around your tree? First off, why are we even mulching in the first place? So there's 3 main reasons for mulching. Protection, you're protecting those roots from, temperature extremes. You're helping retain moisture in the soil, right? So then you'll have to water less and then the tree is less stressed. And then using an organic mulch provides a slow release fertilizer. So that's another way that you're already fertilizing your tree because it breaks down slowly and those nutrients are slowly released and the tree can absorb them. That's why we mulch. But how do we mulch again? So we strongly recommend using organic material because it's going to act as that fertilizer and slowly decompose and the tree is going to eat it up. It also is not adding to any plastic or rubber pollution. Now you'll notice in this picture we have a donut shaped. You don't want the mulch right up against the tree. You can see the root flare. That's where the roots kind of come off of the trunk of the tree. So you want to be able to see that on your tree. If you can't, you've mulched too closely. And then you want it about the width of the crown, especially for a young tree. As your tree gets older and you might have a canopy of 20 feet, you don't have to mulch all the way out there. But with young trees, you want it so that the leaf line is the mulch is at least to the leaf line there. The amount of mulch that you need to add, you really only need about 2 to 4 inches. You don't need 6 to 8 inches. That's getting a little much. And if you have a tree that's already mulched, every year you can add new mulch, but we would highly recommend before you add anything that you go in there and rake into the mulch to kind of loosen it up and help that decomposition process, and then pull any weeds, and then kind of evaluate if you actually need to add new mulch. You probably don't need to add it every single year. One thing that you should not do is volcano mulch. So these are volcano mulches. And if you drive around Orange County, like I do, you see them everywhere. This is when people put their mulch, they make these huge mounds that kind of look like volcanoes. The mulch is right up against the trunk of the tree. And this is also awful for your tree's health. It's creating this really nice, moist, dark environment around the tree trunk, which is great for fungus to move in. It's great for insects to move in. It's also great for small rodents like mice and rats to kind of move in next to your tree. So please do not volcano mulch your trees. And in fact, it's supposed to be 53 degrees today. So if you have volcano mulch at your house, please go outside today, like this guy is doing right here, and move that mulch away. So you can see the root flare is going to be exposed. So please do that as soon as you possibly can. See, this mouse is really distraught because this was his home. He was living right next to your tree, chewing on things and really damaging the tree. Really big question that we get often is how often to water your tree. Now, Cecile kind of talked about when to water a new tree. but it really depends on lots of different things. It depends on the age of the tree. It depends on the soil type that you have. It also depends on the weather. Is it raining every year? And then also the time of year. For newly transplanted trees, as Cecile said, they need to be watered much more frequently than older established trees. But the best way to know if you need to water is by actually getting your hands dirty and feeling the soil. Is the soil moist? You want to dig down with a finger or a little trowel, 2 to 3 inches. If the soil is not moist, you should water your tree. We recommend using some kind of drip system. This tree has what's called a gator bag. You basically fill it up with water. It has holes in the bottom and it slowly releases that water, which provides more consistent watering for your tree. You also put in soaker hoses, but this is a really great kind of a contraption for trees. And then don't forget about your mulch. If you've mulched your tree, you're going to have a less need to water it as frequently. After it's been in the ground for 12 weeks, you still need to water your tree probably weekly. If you're not getting at least an inch of rain every week for several years for that tree really to establish itself. Now for older established trees, we would recommend the gator bag's not going to fit around that, and it's not going to provide water in the entire area. The roots are going out to at least much further than, but a lot of the main roots are right to the canopy. So you want to be watering that whole area. And so we do recommend using an overhead sprinkler. So you make sure you're watering that whole area. If you're using a watering can, you're going to have a lot of difficulty getting that whole area wet. And it's really important that you do deep watering. So you're not just putting on the sprinkler for 5 minutes every day, but putting it on for maybe an hour, 1 day a week, so that the water is having ability to soak down into the soil where the roots are going. Recommend that you look at the plants around it. If you have perennials growing around your trees that are starting to droop, your tree probably also needs water. You might not see the drooping, but if the perennials that you usually don't have to water around your tree are starting to droop, you should also think about watering your tree. Trees that were well established that weren't watered last year really suffered. Even if they didn't die, it definitely stressed them out. So, think about your tree health. It's harder to see what happens in a drought to a tree until, the year later when it might die. But, think about your trees, especially if there's a drought. And then again, with your larger trees, mulch is also your friend. You might not put it all the way out to the edge of the canopy, but you should still mulch around that tree. So that's all I have about watering. So now we're going to change gears and we're going to talk about pruning, and I'm going to turn it over to Cecilia Lillard.
Thanks, Susan. There are some basic things you need to know before we start pruning. Basically, there are only 2 ways to affect a branch: to either shorten it or remove it completely. Shortening it is called a heading cut. So obviously that just makes it shorter. Thinning cuts remove the branch completely. And that's really pruning in a nutshell. Now, there are some things we need to know about how branches grow to make the proper heading cuts. You see axillary buds where the leaf meets the stem. At the end are terminal buds. The terminal buds receive a lot of growth hormones, and so the tree gets bigger and grows outward. What if we were to cut off those terminal buds? The shoots directly behind it get that burst of growth hormones, and it makes the plant bushier. That's the idea of pinching your houseplants to make them bushier. Same thing with woody plants, shrubs or trees. Here we have a woody branch with 2 buds, A that's pointing slightly inward and B pointing outward. And we say we need to prune this tree. Now the buds grow in the direction in which the branches will grow. So what happens if we cut off B? A is going to grow in the direction of that arrow, and we'll get a branch that looks like that, which is okay if we want to fill in a void in the leaf, but usually we don't want branches growing toward the trunk. So instead of cutting off bud B, we'll cut right above B, and then B will get most of the hormones. A gets a little bit of extra hormone, but now we've made the plant grow outward, which is what we wanted. So heading cuts, you cut back to a node or a bud. And when you do cut back, don't leave a stub. On the left-hand side, you can see that the stub has died. And there's a very clear line between the green healthy portion and the brown dead part. When you leave a stub like that, it dies, it can decay, and that invites insects and diseases. So you want to cut back to that joint where you see the green line. And the other kind of cut is a thinning cut, and that removes the branch completely. So we go back to a similar diagram. We have a branch going outward and upward. And if we take that upward branch all the way down, what happens? Not much. We haven't cut off to a bud. So we've just removed some congestion in the center of the tree. So those are the 2 options: to cut back to the branch or a heading cut. And this is a similar idea on a horizontal branch for a thinning cut. So we're not cutting any nodes. Now, there are some ground rules about where you begin pruning, and they're known as the 4 Ds. You cut anything dead, damaged, diseased, or detoured. That's where you should always start. Dead is obvious. When you want to prune something that's damaged, in this one, wherever you see the wood on the inside, you want to cut a little bit into the undamaged bark and let it grow from there. So you want to remove everything that's damaged completely. Diseased, the image on the left is a boring hole for an insect. So you want to keep cutting until you don't see a boring hole anymore. On the right, you want to cut everything that you can see in that bark so that you're back into the clean bark, just like with the damaged limb. And detoured. So we don't want limbs that are crossing. They'll rub together and that'll strip the bark. There's a good chance that they'll die. So you want to cut back anything that is touching another branch and rubbing. March through April, although they're not dormant anymore, at least not this year. It's been early this year. You want to prune early spring, late winter. You don't want to remove more than a quarter or a third of the canopy at any one time. Some trees have sap that runs when you prune it. That's okay. They're called bleeders. Those are oaks, maple, ash, dogwood, elm, birch, sycamore. It's perfectly fine. It does no harm to the tree. And if the tree is large and mature and the branches are big, you really want to consider hiring a certified arborist. But you're ambitious. How do you properly remove a large branch? There is a technique, and there are 2 important structures that you need to know to prune properly. There's the branch collar, which looks like a turtleneck where the branch joins the trunk. And on the right, the bark ridge, which is where the branch knits into the trunk. And if we cut a cross section through that, you can see the branch collar wraps around the branch and protects it, and the bark ridge on the right is where it physically interweaves with the grain of wood in the trunk. When you go to cut the limb off, you never want to cut in the bark ridge, absolutely not. But in the branch collar, you have to cut outside of that as well. That's what happens when you cut in the branch collar. So when you cut the branch collar, this does not get an opportunity to heal. And you can see that there is a bunch of decayed wood in there, and that is absolutely going to invite diseases and pests. This is a picture of a tree on my street where they did an excellent job. You can see the last branch they pruned healing, but there are actually 3 other branches that have been pruned off on that trunk that have healed perfectly. Unless you look, you don't even see them. And that's what we're trying to do when we prune properly, is to allow the tree to heal. So you want to cut this big branch off. There are 2 issues with this picture. They've cut into the branch collar, and when you cut straight down like that, the bark on the underside, as soon as that branch starts to tip off, is going to rip vertically down the trunk of the tree. If you're lucky, it only rips that much. More than likely, you're going to get a big gash. So there's a way to avoid it. So it's called the 3-cut method. 6 to 8 inches outside the branch collar. You make an undercut about a third of the way up through the branch. Then you cut outside of that at B and let the main weight of the branch fall off. And then you can cut at C, just outside the branch collar, and remove a pound of wood. And that's it. And then it won't strip down the trunk of the tree. There was a time when people absolutely loved to top trees, and I will go through with you exactly what is wrong with topping trees. So this is a sugar maple on the Cornell campus in Middletown. You can see it's got a nice healthy trunk. The leader's a little crooked, but it's growing upright. It's got a nice network of scaffold limbs. It looks balanced. There's good airflow. It looks like a really healthy tree. It's never been touched by human hands. I can guarantee that. And then on the same campus is another sugar maple that was topped. I don't know when it was topped, but it has at least 6 leaders. One of them is dying, and look at how congested the center of that tree is. That tree is not long for this world. Maple trees can live 200 to 300 years, as in the picture on the left. The one on the right, if you get 50 years, you're lucky. So please don't top trees.
Well, thank you so much, Cecilia. And thank you so much, Cecile. So just to go over what we talked about today, we talked about the right tree in the right place. We talked a little bit about transplanting trees, and then we talked about the proper way to fertilize, mulch, water, and prune. So thank you so much for joining us today. We invite you to join us next month. We'll be talking about pests of ornamentals, and that will be on Thursday, April 20th, also at noon. And then we ask you to just leave us a review. If you scan the QR code, and I will also put that link in the chat as well. We really appreciate your feedback.